Do you know what time it is? It's supernatural story time. And if you're easily scared, and even if you're not, there's only one thing left to do. Just turn off the lights, because these are stories that you listen to only in the dark. Something in my house. I've lived in a haunted house my entire life. When I was very young, there was always a feeling of unimaginable fear in the rear part of the house. Many of my friends said time and time again that my house was haunted. I never believed them and thought some of them were completely insane. My first experience with ghosts happened when I was 18. I was hanging out with a girl that was a very bad influence. I had just left her house and returned home to go to sleep. Before I fell asleep, it felt like something was laying on me. It almost felt like it had entered my mind, like it was sticking its tongue in my ear. Then I heard the being in a highly audible female voice yell, "Wes!" Immediately, after I said my name, my telephone rang, and it was the girl I had been hanging out with. She had showed me a book about black magic and the occult right before I left her house. I never told anyone about this experience until someone else told me that they had a very similar experience in the home in my room. He described the exact same situation to me. He had the same feelings, same experience, and it said his name as well. The alarm clock went off after that, and it wasn't even set. I began researching these things afterward. The more I learned, the more intensified the sightings were. The most terrifying experience I had was with my cat. She decided to sleep with me that night. She kept getting close to me, and I could tell she was frightened. Soon after, I had a feeling of unimaginable horror. It was so bad it basically incapacitated me. The cat and I looked at the foot of the bed and saw a large, translucent, dark figure. It proceeded to lurk across my room and vanished. As soon as it vanished, it made a loud popping sound, like when you snap your fingers. The cat was watching it at the same time I was. When it disappeared, the cat looked at me and meowed. The most terrifying thing I saw was in a dream. I had done some research on my home, and apparently there was a very rigid, mean old woman that lived in the house before me. In my dream, I was paralyzed. I couldn't move, but I was awake. She then came and made contact with me. She was the scariest thing I have ever seen. She wore a white gown and had a scarier looking face than Gollum from the Lord of the Rings. Her eyes were voids, giant black holes that took up her face. She said nothing to me and just stared. I asked her to please not frighten us. I didn't ask to be born there, and I mean you no harm. After that, activity seemed to stop, except for minor inconveniences like hiding things in the refrigerator or opening and closing doors. I'm not saying ghosts are real, but something very strange, and in my opinion paranormal, happened to me and others. The boy's ghost. My experience took place at my friend's house as I slept on his couch. All I can tell you is what I remember. This is my one and only ghostly experience. My friend normally leaves his TV on in his living room and bedroom all night, but I can't stand TV on while I'm asleep, so I turned the one in the living room off. I didn't sleep for most of the night. I was about half asleep when things started getting weird. I had a weird feeling as though there was a little boy or girl around as the early morning hours approached. As the sun came up, I heard what sounded like a small child playing on the kitchen floor behind me. All of a sudden, a little boy that looked to be about 4 years of age sat on a separate couch next to me. I could see right through him. I said, "I was wondering what that was." He giggled. I talked to him for a long time. I asked him how old he was, and he said 7. I asked him when his birthday was, and he said June 16th. My birthday is next week. I found out hours later that his birthday was a couple of days before. The boy only looked to be about 4 years of age, even though he said he was 7. I regret never asking him what his name was. I didn't talk to him about death or ask him how he died. At one point, I started to ask him a question. It turned into an undistinguished mumble, which made us both giggle. I told him that I was sorry for what had happened. He said, "That's all right." I asked him if he liked it there, and he said, "It's all right." As I looked around the room, everything seemed distorted, as though there were other invisible objects in the room. I asked him if he would stand in front of me. As he approached, he got harder and harder to see, but I could still see him faintly. He just seemed like a good, happy little boy and was nothing to be afraid of. I was lying on my left side with my left hand out further than my right hand. I asked him if he would touch my hand. He touched my left hand and said, "Wow." He giggled. I was expecting to feel a cold finger, but instead the touch felt like static electricity. We talked a while longer, then I asked him to touch my hand again. This time he touched my other hand that I wasn't expecting him to touch. We both giggled. After talking a little longer, I asked if he would stand in front of me again, but I asked him to stand on the corner of the rug so I would know where he was standing. I couldn't see him this time, so I started looking around. He said, "Can you see me? I'm over here." I noticed that I was coming out of the trance or whatever it was, so I said, "I guess I'll see you again." And he said, "Yeah." I later told my friend about this experience, and he just laughed about it. Later, my friend told his girlfriend about it, and she said, "Don't you remember that the landlord had a little boy that died in his sleep 3 years ago in that house because of heart trouble?" This experience was so real to me, but when I heard what had really happened in the house, it just solidified everything a lot more. I just wish that everyone could experience this sort of thing because it can change the way you look at things so drastically. I'm sorry that I can't remember the whole conversation between the boy and me, but all I know is that it's true and that I was talking to a ghost. The cemetery. Melissa looked up at the sign on the corner of her new street, Cemetery Road. At the end of the block, she could see the cemetery, row after row of tombstones behind a high iron gate. Melissa knew the view well by now. It was the same view she had from her bedroom window. Just a month ago, she lived in a pretty house with a view of a park. Then her father had been transferred to the city, and the only house they could afford was on Cemetery Road. Melissa's friends had laughed when she gave them her new address. They thought she was joking. "Hey, aren't you the new girl?" a voice called out from behind her. Melissa turned around to see 2 boys and 1 girl riding bicycles. She recognized them from school. They were in some of the same classes with her. Melissa nodded her head in answer to the question and kept walking. "What's it like living on Cemetery Road?" one of the boys asked. "Pretty spooky?" Melissa felt a flush creep into her cheeks. "Not at all," she said. "I'm not one bit afraid of living there." The girl and the boys kept riding their bikes beside Melissa as she walked quickly towards her house. "I guess you haven't heard the stories about that cemetery," the girl said. "It's haunted by a guardian demon." "Sure," Melissa said. "Do you expect me to believe that?" "It's true," the other boy said. "There's a big tomb in the middle of the graveyard, as a statue of a guardian demon on top of it." "What's so scary about that?" Melissa asked. "The demon comes alive at night," the girl said, "and haunts the cemetery." "I don't believe in things like ghosts," Melissa said. "I dare you to visit the guardian demon at night," one of the boys said. Melissa glared at them. "I wouldn't be afraid to do that." "Dare you to take off its amulet," the girl said. "It has an amulet necklace around its neck. It's said to have special powers." "Bring that amulet to school tomorrow," the other boy said, "and you'll prove how brave you are." "Dare you," the girl taunted. "It's a dare," Melissa said. She ran away from their mocking faces towards her house. She would show them that she wasn't afraid, but she thought of going into the graveyard at night made her shudder. She had to get this amulet this afternoon before it got too dark outside. Melissa's house was the second from the end of the road that led into the cemetery. A rickety old house that no one lived in sat right next to the graveyard. Melissa pushed open the door to her house, went inside and threw her books onto the bench in the hallway. Before she could run up to her room to change, her mother rushed into the hallway. She told Melissa that they were meeting her father at his office as a surprise and then going out for dinner. Melissa tried to protest, but it did her no good. Not long after the argument was settled, she was driving downtown with her mother, worrying about when she would go to the cemetery. They didn't come home until 10 that night. Melissa went up to her room, put on her nightgown, and nervously stared out the window. The tombstones in the graveyard were bathed in the eerie light of the moon. Melissa wondered how she would find the guardian demon there. Finally, her mother came in to say good night. Melissa lay on her bed waiting for the house to fall silent. When at last everything was quiet, she looked at the clock. It was 11:38. Outside her screen window, the September night was still warm. She picked up the flashlight she used for camping trips and quietly stole down the stairs and out of the house. Melissa crept through the darkness past the rickety old house next to the graveyard and then through the arched entrance to the cemetery. She was afraid to use her flashlight in case someone in a nearby house saw her. The full moon shed enough light on the white gravel path for her to find her way in the dark. Suddenly, the stillness in the cemetery was broken by the weird call of a night animal. Melissa froze in her steps. Until now, she had not been afraid, but now the sound reminded her that other things were out there in the night watching her. She switched on her flashlight and swung it in a wide circle. The beam lit up the cold gray marble tombstones around her. Melissa kept walking towards the middle of the cemetery, where the guardian demon was to be found. The gravel path sloped upward at a slight angle, and soon she found herself standing on a small hill. From the streetlights around the edge of the cemetery, she could tell she was near the center. Melissa shone the beam of the flashlight onto the nearby tombstones. The face of an angel stared back out of the darkness, making her catch her breath in fear. Then she saw it. The guardian demon was like a dark shadow in the night, crouching on top of a huge white marble tomb. Melissa made her way on trembling legs over to the statue. The night animal shrieked again, sending a chill through her body. She stood underneath the demon and shone her light on it. The creature was made of smooth black marble except for its eyes, which were of shining green stones, and around its neck, just as the girl had said, was an amulet necklace. Melissa climbed onto a step of the white base and read the inscription etched into the marble. Dominatio per malum. From her Latin studies, she could translate the saying that meant power through evil. For a second she wanted to turn and run away as fast as she could from the tomb and its warning, but there, only inches from her hand, was the collar she had come to get. She set down her flashlight beside the demon and reached both hands around its marbled neck to unfasten the amulet necklace. She whispered grateful thanks as its buckle came easily undone. But at that very moment, the bell on a nearby church began to strike the midnight hour. It frightened Melissa so that she almost dropped the amulet. On the fourth stroke of the bell, Melissa picked up her flashlight and shone it into the guardian demon's face. To her horror, the green eyes gleamed back at her like it was alive. On the eighth stroke of the bell, Melissa climbed down from the tombstone and heard a wicked snarl come from the statue. On the 12th stroke of the bell, Melissa ran down the gravel path of the graveyard, her heart in her throat, and her mind in a frenzy of fear. The light from the flashlight wavered on the path in front of her as Melissa ran away from the guardian demon. She tried to tell herself that she had imagined the demon's snarl. But then, from behind her, she heard the hard thud of creature feet on the gravel path, and a long, angry roar sounded through the night air. Melissa turned around and saw what she feared. Two big green eyes were following her in the darkness. Finally, Melissa reached the entrance to the cemetery. She could see her house ahead. It was only yards away now. She ran faster and faster until she reached the front door. With trembling hands, she twisted open the knob and ran inside. She shut the door behind her, double-locked it, and ran up the stairs, panting with fear. She slipped into her bedroom and shut the door. From outside her screen window, she could hear a neighbor's dog howling weirdly in the night. But suddenly it stopped. Melissa looked down at her trembling hands and saw the amulet necklace. Quickly she went to her dresser, opened the top drawer, and hid the amulet inside. Then she got undressed and lay down between the sheets, trembling with exhaustion and fear. Melissa stared out her window at the ghostly shape of the tombstones in the moonlight. She listened to the night sounds, and finally, after a long time, she fell into a fitful sleep. Melissa woke with a start. She had been having a terrible nightmare. In the dream, a demon was leaning over her. Melissa opened her eyes and stared into the darkness of her room. Then she remembered the amulet. She switched on her lamp and ran to the dresser. Quickly, she pulled out the top drawer. Then Melissa saw the deep claw marks on top of the dresser. She whirled around, and there, standing by her closed door, she saw the guardian demon, staring back at her with glowing green eyes. Encounters with the Supernatural. Sometime around the 1970s, my twin brother Billy had split from his wife and was awaiting a divorce. He had 2 young children, and for reasons we don't need to get into, he had full custody of them. Now, we both worked in the large aircraft factory in Belfast, which was close to us. We worked as fitters. Billy, though, was having problems with his working hours due to babysitters, etc., and so it was agreed that our mother would look after them full time. Now, in those days, there were rows of streets with small 2-up, 2-down terrace houses. When growing up, my brother and I shared a small room with bunk beds in one of these small houses. Anyway, my mother and father still lived there, and this is very important to remember as it has great relevance later in the story. The street name was Frome Street, and another street sprung out from the end like an L shape. This street was named Turn Street. Got that? We lived about 5 doors up from Turn Street. Around 1979, when we were both 25 years old, a house directly facing my mother's in Frome Street came up for sale. This, we thought at the time, was the answer to my brother's prayers, because now he could be nearer to his kids and see them as often as he liked. He moved into the house, and it was only 2 weeks or so later that something was to happen that would change the way he thought about things forever. I lived a short distance away with my wife, and I decided to walk around and pay a visit. I was on night shift, and so this was sometime early in the afternoon. Both my father and brother were at work. My aunt was already there, as she always was when I arrived, and right away I thought there was something wrong by the way my mother was acting. Kind of strange, if you like, and my aunt, who never shut up then, was also behaving funny and was unusually quiet. As I played with Billy's children in the next room, I could hear snippets of talk, and to be honest, my ears pricked up. It was clear from what I could hear that Billy had wrapped them up around 2 a.m. and that he was in a terrible state over something. I confronted my mother, who clammed up, but my aunt turned to her. "Better tell him," she urged. Well, after a long pause, my mother informed me that Billy had seen a ghost in his house, and he had been almost demented when he roused them from their bed. He had made our mom promise not to tell me, which I still don't understand why to this day, so I was pretty much sworn to secrecy. It was biting at me, though, and about 2 weeks later, Billy and I and a couple of friends went out for a few beers. To cut to the chase, I waited until he was a bit the worse for wear, and I somehow brought up the subject about ghosts. He finally admitted that he went to bed about midnight that night, but it was so clammy that he lay on top of the blanket. When he awoke, he was freezing, and the clock on the bedside cabinet read 1:55 a.m. He couldn't believe it. This was the summer, yet he felt as though he was inside a freezer. The bedroom door was opened about 3 inches, and some light from an outside lamp made it so that he could see the inside of the room fairly clearly. He heard a noise on the landing, and at once he thought burglars had gotten in. He reached down below his bed for an old bat he left there, but it was gone. Remember, there were no mobile phones in those days, so he felt pretty frightened. Then the door swung open. He claimed a young girl in a blue dress with long flowing dark hair and a large locket around her neck floated in past his bed. She didn't look at him or make any motions, but kept her hands to her sides. When she moved behind the bedroom door, he flicked the light on and pulled at the door. There was nothing there. He ran down the stairs 3 steps at a time, he later claimed, and he said to make matters worse, the front door seemed to be jammed. He almost pulled it off the hinges. He never went back to the house to live, and quickly sold it. However, my dad and I always believed it was a case of hallucination, because there was one thing about Billy. Billy never lied, ever. If you think the story ends here, then you're in for a shock. 15 years later, 2 new men came into our squad at work. We asked if they wanted to join our tea syndicate, which was 50 pence or $1 a week then. One joined, and his name was Robert. During the first week, we were all sitting around the table, 6 or 7 in all, when someone said it was a disgrace what the newspapers would print. Seems the poltergeists have been giving a family in Wales a hard time. What a load of nonsense, the same person said. No, Robert declared. These things exist. My aunt was tortured by one during the 60s. It would start off by hiding things behind cushions and places where they were easily found, but it got worse. One time when the chimney sweep was cleaning the chimney, a load of small stuff belonging to them, but had gone missing, rings and stuff, fell down with a suit. After this, my uncle was assaulted in the dark on at least 2 occasions. Then, when they stepped outside for a couple of minutes, they found to their horror that when they re-entered, the sofa and chairs had all been moved upstairs. This was an impossibility, and this was just what drove them out. They left every stick of furniture and left with just the clothes on their back. Where was this? Someone asked. Was this in Wales? No, Robert replied. It wasn't. It was not far from here in a street named Frome Street. I jumped up from my seat. Was it about 4 or 5 doors up from Turn Street? I asked. I immediately saw I had struck a chord. How do you know that? Robert asked. No one knows that. I know, I said, because my brother lived in it after that time, and he saw something. Someone started to clap, and they all laughed, thinking we had made this all up, but I didn't know the guy then. I met him about a year or so ago, and that was the first time we talked about it. I met another old neighbor from there who told me that everyone knew about that house. I don't believe my parents did, though, or if they did, they didn't believe it. This I swear is true as I remember it, and I will go to my grave believing that there is something that we just don't know about. The house is knocked down now, and they have widened the road and built new houses. I often wonder if it, whatever it was, is still there. A haunting in Belgium. My experience happened in 2007 while I was living in Belgium as a civilian employee working for the U.S. Army. It was 4 a.m. I was sleeping next to my wife. I woke myself when I heard myself answer yes to a question. I don't remember hearing a question, I only heard me saying yes. I rolled over and opened my eyes, and there was a whitish gray being with black eyes above me. I shook my head just to ensure I wasn't sleeping. The being came directly to my face and seemed to be scanning my head. For whatever reason, I was not scared. To this day, I try to understand why I wasn't scared. It appeared to be male, but did not have the stereotypical appearance attributed to space aliens. I felt no weight or energy from him. The being raised up slightly and looked to his left and opened his mouth and did what I described as grimaced. He then looked back at me and then moved up and got smaller and then disappeared. I did not turn and look at what he was looking at because I wanted to ensure I watched his every move. Not that I think that I could have stopped him from doing anything. To this day I wonder what he was looking at. Since that experience, every day I think about what happened and what it meant. I know for sure that I wasn't dreaming or imagining it. I was scared every day after the experience because I wasn't sure that I would have the same composure as I did with the initial experience. I think I wasn't scared because I think I was busy trying to understand what was happening. After that experience, I never saw him again, but there were pounces and depressions on the bed. They happened in the daytime also when the room was dark, when the rolodons were down. My wife was sleeping in the upstairs bedroom and something hit her pillow twice. My 26-year-old son slept in the same room and something appeared in the room, but I don't know all the details of his experience. My wife and I have 5 children. 3 of the 5 have seen ghosts. Sometime in 1996, while we were living in Las Vegas, my daughter, who is now 23, saw a toddler in her room sitting in a chair dangling her feet and just staring at her. While we were living at Yokota Air Base in Japan, I was staying in the temporary lodging facility. It was 2003. My son, who is now 14, saw a male ghost. My son was sleeping in the room with his brother. He said he was asleep and something was hitting his bed. He said to his brother to stop. When the hitting of the bed continued, he sat up and saw the ghost at the bathroom entrance. He said he wasn't scared, but he felt like the ghost was transmitting his terror to him. He said he felt a distinct difference between his feelings and what the ghost was transmitting. The Yokota Library has a history of people jumping and committing suicide. During our tour at Yokota, one of the base counselors attempted suicide from the TLF building, but did not survive. The ghost that didn't like blue. I had just moved into a second floor, 3-bedroom apartment in Queens, New York in 1998. My new roommate Chris had lived in the apartment for a couple of years before I got there. I moved in with the understanding that the kitchen, bathroom, and front hallway were soon to be painted. The apartment was new and very nice, and I thought that some new paint would make the place even better. One morning, about 2 weeks after I had moved in, Chris and I were having coffee in the kitchen, and he asked me how I was settling in. Great, I replied, but for some strange reason, I keep having these dreams about airplanes and airports. Chris didn't reply to this, but simply nodded. I didn't think anything of it. But I never mentioned to Chris that some odd things kept happening. My lights would be on when I came home, my windows wide open, and my phone was making a strange crackling noise when I used it. I just kept believing my rational explanations for everything. One of these odd happenings involved my best friend. One night, he called my phone in my room and I wasn't home. When I saw him the next day, he asked why my roommate answered the phone. I told him Chris wasn't home that night, that he'd been at work until 2 a.m. My friend told me that when he called, the man picked up and abruptly said, "She's not here," and the line went dead. I asked Chris about it, and he looked just as surprised as I was. He wasn't home that night, he told me. Several days later, the contractor and his workers started in on the paint job. One night, I came home and found one of the workers in the kitchen painting by himself. I greeted him and went into my room. I was puttering about in my room and heard a loud voice from the kitchen kind of shouting. So I opened my door and looked at the guy on the ladder. He looked at me blankly. I said, "Hey, is Chris back?" He shook his head and I was surprised. I could have sworn I heard talking. "Okay, well, if he comes home, please let me know." I went back to my room. A few minutes later, again the muffled shouting. I opened my door and both the painter and I looked at each other. "Is he back yet? I heard voices," I said, looking around. The painter shook his head at me wide-eyed. Chris came home soon after that, along with a contractor who came to pick up his worker. But the painter started complaining loudly in Portuguese and gesticulating all over the kitchen. The contractor took Chris aside and spoke to him, and then Chris took me aside and told me something that gave me chills. He said that the worker was telling his boss that someone was telling him not to paint the kitchen blue. He kept hearing someone telling him to stop, and it was the wrong color. He was very frightened and threatened to walk out on the job. Chris and I went back into the kitchen to smooth things over and found the poor painter kneeling on the floor, praying with his rosary beads in his hands. He was absolutely wild-eyed and shaking. From then on, the workers begged me to stay with them when they were about to be left alone in the house. They were clearly terrified. The apartment was finally painted, and Chris and I were sitting at the kitchen table talking about what happened. "I have a confession to make," Chris said quietly. "I've experienced weird things in this place ever since I moved in. I didn't want to tell you because I thought you wouldn't want to move in. I never really believed in anything supernatural, but when you told me you were having dreams of airports and airplanes, well, you see, I didn't tell you, but the person who lived here before us died here. He was a flight attendant. Neither one of us wanted to put too much thought into what was going on, and we didn't talk about it again. We both liked the apartment and wanted to stay, despite the strange happenings. But then something happened that really scared me. One night, very late, I was already in bed. I heard Chris scream. I jumped out of bed and ran to his room. He was absolutely pale and pointed to the window. "What is that? What is that?" he screamed, and I looked. A strange coppery red liquid seemed to be dripping down from the side of the window. I looked very closely at it. It was a strange liquid that of course looked like blood. I turned to Chris to study him, even though he was cowering behind me. No, it wasn't a practical joke. Chris's face reminded me of the painter kneeling in the hallway with his rosary beads, terrified. Genuine terror isn't something you can fake easily. I don't know what that stuff was dripping down from the windowsill, but I cleaned it up with some bleach and gave Chris something to help him sleep. But I couldn't. I tried to rationalize what it could have been, but didn't come up with any solid reasons. I've never experienced anything like whatever was going on in that apartment, but I felt that if it really was the deceased flight attendant, he definitely was trying to tell us he wasn't happy we were there, and he certainly didn't approve of the blue paint in the kitchen. I moved out shortly after the red liquid incident. I often think about that place. I know I'll never forget it. The evil spirit. My family moved into a home in Reno, Nevada back in the early 80s. We'd heard noises at all hours of the day and watched a tall Indian in a headband walk around our home. One night, we had all just gone to bed, and a few minutes later we heard a loud bang coming from the kitchen door that leads into the garage. My dad told me to check it out, so I opened the door and saw a large knife sticking in the door. All of our doors and windows were locked. We stayed in this house for another couple of months, and every day something happened. Eventually, we just moved out. Something that follows you home. A friend of mine was mentioning for some time that her child was waking up at night. I offered to come over and see if I could detect any energies in her home. I started the sweep of the house and entered one of the kids' rooms. Up in one of the corners, I could see a cluster of energy that was soft and warm. It was the kid's spirit guide. I continued checking each room, and the final room was her other kid's room. The room itself was clear, and so I opened the closet. I first sensed its presence like hate. Evil, it spoke and said, "What are you doing here? Get out! Get out!" Next came an image I will never forget. I saw goblins and horrid little creatures with long, sharp claws climbing down from the closet towards me. I closed the door and cleansed the house after that. I left and returned to my own home, continuously saying prayers and asking for protection and asking that it not enter my own home. When I arrived home and hung my keys up on a hook and sat down to talk to my husband about what I had seen, he was sitting there, and the keys were then thrown across the room, and as we both looked at each other and then to the corner at the keys on the floor, I saw a huge energy field move towards me. I couldn't breathe and was screaming in fear until my husband kept talking to me to get a handle on the situation. I was able to clear it later and would have 2 years of clearings to get rid of it. One night out on my porch, I saw an image of my back door and a person dressed in a dark robe from head to foot with its face pressed up against my back door. Just because I deal with this stuff does not mean I am not afraid of it. The haunted alleyway. Everyone knew about the alleyway. It was a passage between my favorite Mexican restaurant and my town history museum. It was haunted by the spirit of a gangster who was killed by a rival gang in a bar fight. Not only was this ghost a gang member, but a murderer also. It was a rather snowy night, since it was the start of the snowy season we often get here. I sat at my table finishing my meal. I had a lot on my mind that day, since the roads were most likely too closed and I couldn't get home in time. I listened to the noises around me, from the laughter coming from the bar to the doorbell ringing when somebody walked in. I was just about to leave when the town drunk came into the restaurant. His name was Alfred, and he lived in a small house that was falling apart. His reputation for getting into fights and heavy drinking kept anyone from feeling sorry for him. He walked into the place looking like a sewer rat in blue jeans, white shirt, and a jacket. He walked over to the bar and took a seat. He stunk of garbage and dead animal. "Have you any of you gentlemen seen the man in the alleyway? He looked hurt," Alfred asked. The whole restaurant went quiet, and everyone stared at Alfred with fear-filled eyes. Everyone knew not to go in the alleyway at night. Everyone took the well-lit sidewalk. But heavily drunk Alfred said, "I'm going to have a talk with this gangster." The barkeeper was opening his mouth to warn him, but he thought he could use this lesson. Alfred stumbled out the door, and then bang, bang, 2 loud gunshots were heard. After that, no one left the bar alone that night.